It was Christmas Eve, 2002, in Modesto, California, when a young, pregnant woman named Laci Peterson was reported missing. She was 8 months pregnant with her first child, and her family was devastated. This case, which began as a search for a missing woman, soon turned into one of the most notorious murder cases in modern history. Laci's family and friends immediately launched a search, combing through neighborhoods, putting up posters, and making pleas on national television. Her husband, Scott Peterson, was by their side in those early days, appearing to be a grieving and desperate husband. But as the investigation went on, suspicions began to grow. The police began focusing on Scott, who was acting strangely given the circumstances. He had inconsistent stories, and his behavior seemed off. Then, a critical discovery changed the direction of the case. Investigators learned that Scott was having an affair with a woman named Amber Fry. Amber came forward to the police, revealing Scott had told her he was a widower, before Laci even went missing. This revelation shocked the public, and suspicion of Scott Peterson intensified. Scott claimed that on the day Laci disappeared, he was fishing alone in the San Francisco Bay. This alibi seemed shaky, especially when investigators learned he'd recently bought a small boat, just weeks before Laci vanished. As the search continued, the authorities began to suspect that Scott might have used this boat to dump Laci's body in the bay. Months passed, with no sign of Laci. But then, in April 2003, a tragic discovery was made: the remains of a woman and a small baby washed up on the shores of the San Francisco Bay. The bodies were quickly identified as those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, whom she'd planned to name Connor. With this devastating confirmation, police arrested Scott Peterson. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial. There was no direct physical evidence linking him to Laci's death. But the circumstantial evidence painted a grim picture. Scott had bought a boat and hadn't told anyone. He'd lied about being a widower to his girlfriend, Amber Fry. And he acted suspiciously both before and after Laci's disappearance. In 2004, Scott Peterson's trial began. The prosecution argued that Scott was a man who wanted freedom. He was feeling trapped by the impending responsibility of fatherhood and wanted a way out of his marriage. They argued that he had planned Laci's murder so he could start fresh, without facing the consequences. The prosecution showed the jury evidence, including Scott's affair and his odd behavior. They presented Scott's fishing trip in the San Francisco Bay on Christmas Eve as part of a calculated plan to dispose of Laci's body. But Scott's defense team argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial and far from conclusive. They contended that there was no direct link between Scott and Laci's death, and they suggested the possibility of another unknown suspect. But the jury was not convinced. After months of testimony in a highly publicized trial, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Laci and second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. In March 2005, he was sentenced to death. But this wasn't the end. In 2020, after years of appeals, California's Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, citing issues with jury selection during his trial. Scott's death sentence was reduced to life in prison, where he remains today. The Scott Peterson case captivated America. It's a story of betrayal, lies, and a family left shattered. The case raised questions about circumstantial evidence, the responsibilities of a spouse, and the unsettling possibility that someone could murder their own family for personal freedom. Scott Peterson continues to maintain his innocence, and to this day, the case still sparks debate and fascination. Was it a tragic, cruel plan carried out by a man desperate to escape? Or did circumstantial evidence convict an innocent man? This case reminds us of the profound impact a single crime can have, not only on the families involved but on an entire nation.